The desert rain wasn't real rain. Celine knew this because she'd studied Earth meteorology during the first contact protocols back when the Aylar Coalition still believed understanding humans meant understanding their weather patterns. The water falling on her, now soaking through torn uniform fabric and into wounds that burned with every step, was runoff from atmospheric processors. Recycled moisture that had passed through 1,000 ventilation systems before condensing in the cold Nevada night. She'd stopped finding Earth's recycling systems depressing about 4 weeks into running. Now she just found everything wet, which was reason enough to hate this planet's desert outposts almost as much as she hated the people hunting her. Almost. The pain in her side flared white hot as she stumbled against a corrugated metal wall. Her hand came away dark with blood. Not the first time tonight. Probably not the last if she lived long enough to bleed again. 6 weeks. She'd been running for 6 weeks across 3 star systems in half of North America. 6 weeks since the emergency beacon from Kais Gate went dark. Since she'd made the choice that saved 10,000 lives and cost 300 others. Since the Coalition Council had looked at her with gratitude in their eyes and calculation in their hearts. Since she'd realized that being a hero meant being useful until you became inconvenient. The betrayal had come quietly. No dramatic confrontation, no angry accusations, just transferred command codes that no longer worked. Communications that went unanswered. And then 3 days after the medal ceremony, Korvath Syndicate operatives materializing in her quarters with plasma blades and the kind of professional efficiency that spoke of inside information. She'd killed 2, wounded a 3rd. The rest had driven her out a window and into the long fall toward obscurity, or death. She wasn't particular about which anymore. Celine pressed harder against the wound in her side, feeling the synthetic fabric of her undersuit grow slick beneath her fingers. The tactical analyzer in her combat optics had stopped giving damage assessments an hour ago, which meant either the device was broken or her injuries had exceeded its programming parameters. Neither option encouraged optimism. Through the curtain of not quite rain, she could see lights. Human habitation clustered in the characteristic pattern of a frontier outpost. The kind of place where Earth's government presence ended and individual survival began. Where people came to escape questions, regulations, and the kind of oversight that made hiding impossible. Where a wounded Aylar commander might find shelter. Or a quick death. Her legs chose that moment to inform her they were no longer accepting commands. She went down hard, catching herself on one hand against rough concrete. The impact sent fresh agony through her ribs. Probably broken. Definitely problematic. The light swam in her vision, closer than before but still impossibly far. 300 faces rose in her memory. Young ones mostly. Soldiers who trusted her tactical genius, her strategic reputation, her promises that the defense of Kai's Gate would hold. She'd memorized every name from the casualty list. Recited them in the dark hours when sleep wouldn't come and guilt wouldn't leave. Private Thalen, Corporal Messery, Lieutenant Kavan, who just made rank. 300 names for 10,000 saved. The council had called it acceptable losses, called her a hero, called for champagne and press releases while she'd stood in the trophy room of her own success and wondered why victory felt like drowning. She pushed to her feet, took 3 more steps before her vision tunneled to a point of light surrounded by encroaching darkness. The last thing she saw before consciousness fled was a door, blue paint peeling in the desert climate. A sign blinking in 3 languages, the universal symbols for medical facility competing with Earth's archaic cross and serpent emblem. The last thing she thought was that dying in a human clinic seemed appropriately ironic. Then the darkness took her and thinking stopped. Garrett Hollis had stopped believing in coincidence around the same time he'd stopped believing in the essential goodness of command structure. Both revelations had arrived on the same day in 2066 in a field hospital outside a city whose name he'd never learned how to pronounce, watching a man die because protocol mattered more than speed. So when something hit his clinic door at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, he didn't assume accident or chance. He assumed trouble, which in his experience was assumption enough. The sound came again. Not quite a knock. More like someone falling against metal and trying very hard not to make noise about it. The kind of sound that spoke of injury and desperation in equal measure. Garrett set down the medical supply inventory he had been pretending to update and moved to the door with the practiced quiet of someone who'd learned to walk soft in places where noise attracted attention. His hand hovered over the lock mechanism, while his mind ran through possibilities at the speed of long practice. Drunk spacer who'd mistaken a medical clinic for a bar. Lost tourist who couldn't read the very clear signage in 3 languages. Someone's idea of a prank because apparently, even at the edge of civilized space, humanity's capacity for stupidity remained infinite. Or someone hurt. He opened the door. She fell forward into his clinic, caught herself on one hand against the frame, and looked up at him with eyes that were absolutely furious about needing help. Blood seeped through her fingers where she pressed them against her side. Dark blood, worrying amounts of it soaking through what his tactical eye immediately cataloged as military-grade combat wear. Her hair, darker than the desert night, was plastered to her skull by the recycled rain. A gash above her left eyebrow had already stopped bleeding, which meant either she'd been injured hours ago or her physiology processed trauma faster than human standard. Then he saw her ears, long and elegantly swept back from her temples in a curve that no human genetic variation could explain. Aylar. He'd read about them seeing hollows during the treaty broadcast, but never met one in person. The reports hadn't mentioned how otherworldly they looked up close, how the slight luminescence in their eyes caught light like sunset through storm clouds, how utterly human their expression of pain and pride could be. "Are you going to stare?" she asked through gritted teeth. Her voice carried the accent of someone who'd learned English from formal instruction rather than conversation, each word precisely placed, carefully controlled. "Or are you going to help?" Garrett moved. His hands went to her shoulders, steadying her, his mind already shifting into the calm space where he did his best work. The space where panic became procedure and chaos became checklist. Where the person in front of him stopped being a mystery and became simply a patient who needed care. "Can you walk?" He kept his voice level, professional. "Treatment room's 20 feet. If you can make it, we'll skip the dramatic collapse routine." Something flickered in her eyes. Surprise, maybe. Or the beginning of respect that came from recognizing competence when dying made assessment difficult. "I can walk." She could barely. But Garrett kept one hand on her elbow the whole way, feeling the tremors that meant shock was setting in, noting the way she favored her left leg, cataloging injuries with the efficiency of someone who'd done this too many times to count. Each step was a negotiation between her will and her body's rebellion. Each breath came shallow and controlled. He got her onto the treatment table and immediately began cutting away the ruined fabric around her wounds. His scissors were precise and impersonal, revealing damage that made his jaw tighten even as his expression remained neutral. "This is going to hurt," he said, reaching for the diagnostic scanner. "The scanner, I mean. The actual treatment comes after, and that's going to hurt worse." "I've been hurt before." Her voice was tight but steady. "I can see that." The scanner's results made him pause. 3 deep lacerations, one dangerously close to what his medical database assured him was the alar equivalent of a major artery. Bruising that suggested she'd been thrown against something solid with considerable force. Burns on her palms that looked like she'd grabbed a plasma conduit barehanded, and older wounds beneath the new ones. Scars that spoke of a life lived in combat. "You have terrible luck," he observed, prepping the surgical field with practiced efficiency. "Or terrible enemies." "Both." She was watching him with an intensity that made Garrett think of predators. The kind that tracked movement not from fear but from assessment, cataloging his skill level, his threat potential, his value as ally or obstacle. He'd seen that look before. In soldiers who'd learned that survival meant never stopping the evaluation of everyone and everything around them. "You're not asking questions," she said. "Would you answer them?" "No." Garrett smiled despite himself reaching for antiseptic. "Then I'm saving us both time. This is going to sting." "People always say that. It doesn't help." "I know. But lying about it seems worse." The antiseptic hit the wound and she hissed, but didn't flinch away. Her hands gripped the edge of the treatment table hard enough that he heard the metal creak. But she held still with the discipline of someone who understood that moving during treatment was the difference between healing and infection. Garrett worked quickly, his hands steady, cleaning the lacerations with the kind of focused care that had nothing to do with who someone was and everything to do with what they needed. The synthetic tissue stimulator hummed as he passed it over the injuries, encouraging cellular regeneration at the molecular level. Her body was already responding faster than the device's settings anticipated. Healing accelerated beyond human parameters. "You're Ayler," he said, not quite a question. "You've heard of us. Read about you. Never met one of your people before." He began suturing, now his fingers moving with the precision of thousands of repetitions. The history text said you mostly keep to your own systems. They also said Ayler have accelerated healing. He tied off the first suture with hands that had forgotten how to shake years ago. "Good news is you'll recover faster than I expected. Bad news is you'll probably ignore my medical advice and leave before you should." That surprised a short laugh out of her, quickly cut off by pain. "You're making assumptions. I've treated soldiers." He moved to the second wound, deeper than the first. "Stubborn is a universal constant." She was quiet while he worked on the second laceration. Garrett let the silence settle. Some patients needed talking, needed distraction from the reality of someone else's hands inside their wounds. Others needed to focus to control their breathing, to maintain whatever dignity they could, while vulnerability was measured in sutures and bandages. She struck him as the latter type. The clinic's ambient systems hummed around them. Outside, the desert rain continued its recycled fall. Garrett's hands moved with automatic precision, closing torn flesh, encouraging the body to remember its original architecture. He was nearly finished with the second suture when she spoke again. "Do you realize, human," she said, her voice carrying weight he couldn't quite parse, "that I'm not an ordinary person?" Garrett paused, looked up from his work, met her eyes directly. They were an unusual color, amber with flecks of something darker, like looking into sunset through storm clouds. There was weight in that gaze. Layers of meaning he could sense but not quite understand. Warning maybe, testing, genuine curiosity about how he'd react to whatever truth she carried. He went back to his suturing. "I don't care who you are," he said, his voice even and honest. "You're bleeding in my clinic, which means you're my patient. That's all that matters right now." The silence that followed felt different, sharper somehow. Surprised? Garrett finished the suture, tied it off with the kind of neat knot that would dissolve cleanly as she healed, and reached for the bandaging supplies. When he glanced up again, her expression had shifted into something he couldn't quite read. Something that looked almost like relief. "Just like that?" she asked. "Just like that." Garbadette began wrapping the bandages, his touch gentle but efficient. "I'm going to make an educated guess that you're someone important. The expensive boots under all that blood suggest money or military. The way you keep cataloging exits suggests training. The fact that someone tried very hard to kill you suggests you've made powerful enemies." He secured the bandage and moved to treat the cut above her eyebrow. "None of that changes the fact that you need medical treatment and I need to provide it. Stay still." She did. But she was watching him with that predator's focus again, evaluating something beyond his medical competence. "Most people react differently," she said quietly. "To what wounded patients?" He cleaned the facial wound with careful strokes. "I'd be a terrible medic if I did." The cut above her eyebrow was superficial, already beginning to close on its own. He applied a thin strip of synthetic skin anyway, knowing that facial wounds attracted attention. And attention, in his experience, was rarely helpful when someone was running from the kind of trouble that came with plasma burns and assassination attempts. "There." He stepped back, surveying his work with the critical eye of someone who knew exactly how much damage a body could take and still recover. "The one on your face will barely scar. The ones on your torso will take more time. You've got accelerated healing, but physics is physics. You push too hard, too fast, you'll tear the sutures, and we'll be back where we started." "I'm Selena," she said. She said it like he should recognize the name, like it carried weight and expectation in those syllables, like it meant something beyond simple identification. Garrett nodded, checking her pupil response with a penlight, looking for signs of concussion that her earlier stumbling suggested, but her current alertness contradicted. "Garrett Hollis," he replied. "Nice to meet you, though. I wish the circumstances were better. No concussion, which is good news. You can sleep without worrying. I'll need to wake you every hour." He moved to prep a pain medication drip, calibrating dosage based on what little information his medical database contained about Ayler physiology. Not much, mostly theoretical. He'd have to watch her responses and adjust. I'm setting you up in the recovery room, he continued, his voice falling into the practiced rhythm of post-treatment protocol. There's a bed, basic entertainment console, and a call button if you need anything. I'll be checking on you every few hours. Standard procedure for major trauma cases. Just like that, she said again. This time there was something almost vulnerable in the repetition. Something that suggested the words meant more than their surface simplicity. Just like that. Garrett hung the medication drip and helped her sit up, noting the careful way she moved the soldier's awareness of her body's limits, even through the haze of pain and medication. Although I should warn you, my coffee is terrible, my food is mediocre, and my bedside manner has been described as aggressively practical. If you were expecting luxury accommodations, you came to the wrong frontier station. This time her laugh was genuine, startled out of her by his absolute refusal to treat the situation with the gravity she clearly expected. You're an odd human, Garrett Hollis. I've been called worse. He slid an arm around her shoulders, supporting her weight as they made their slow way to the recovery room. Come on, let's get you somewhere more comfortable than a treatment table. Fair warning, the bed's not great either, but it's better than bleeding on my floor. The recovery room was small but clean, functional in the way that frontier facilities managed when resources were limited, but standards weren't. A single bed with sheets that had been washed so many times they'd achieved a softness that new fabric never managed. A window that looked out over the desert darkness. Medical monitoring equipment that hummed with the quiet efficiency of machines that knew their job and did it without complaint. Garrett got her settled, adjusted the medication flow to a rate that should manage pain without completely sedating her, and pulled up a thin thermal blanket that had seen better days but still functioned perfectly well. Get some rest, he said, heading for the door. Your body needs time to heal, even with your advantages. Garrett, her voice stopped him at the threshold. When he turned back, she was studying him with that same intense focus, but softer now. Curious rather than assessing. People usually react differently to my name, she said quietly. To my presence, to what I am. Would you prefer I did? He leaned against the door frame, genuinely asking. I can be more impressed if that helps, maybe faint dramatically. I'm not good at it, but I could charm him. The corner of her mouth twitched, almost a smile. No. Then I'll stick with practical medicine and terrible coffee. He paused, something in her expression, making him add words he hadn't planned. In my experience, legendary warriors bleed just as much as ordinary people. Their wounds close the same way when properly treated. Everything else is just noise. For the first time since she'd fallen through his door, something like real peace crossed her face. Not the sharp, controlled responses of a soldier maintaining composure. Something genuine and almost fragile. Thank you, she said quietly. Garrett nodded and left her to rest, pulling the door most of the way closed, but leaving it open enough that he'd hear if she called. He returned to his main office to file treatment notes and clean the blood from his floor. Outside, the desert rain continued its recycled fall, washing nothing away but making everything wet. Somewhere in the Nevada night, dangers he couldn't name were probably planning their next move. Problems that would arrive with morning or sooner. But for now, there was just the quiet hum of medical equipment, the clean smell of antiseptic, and a patient resting in the next room who'd asked if he realized she wasn't ordinary. He told her the truth. He didn't care. What he hadn't told her was that he'd recognized the name. That his tablet had military news feeds he checked out of habit monitoring conflicts that no longer involved him but still shaped the systems he inhabited. That he'd seen images of Commander Celine of the Aylar Coalition, the strategic genius of Kai's Gate, the warrior who'd turned the tide of frontier wars with a maneuver analysts were still arguing about. That he knew the Corvath Syndicate had posted a bounty of 50 million credits for her capture or death. That choosing to treat her anyway was possibly the stupidest decision he'd made since leaving military service, and that was a category with considerable competition. He looked at the blood on his hands already drying, already becoming just another stain in a frontier clinic that had seen its share of trouble. Looked at the closed door of the recovery room where someone who could probably kill him in 17 different ways was sleeping under sedation. Garrett washed his hands in the sonic cleanser, watching blood vapor into nothingness. Then he went to make terrible coffee. Some things he'd learned were better discovered as they happened. Morning arrived the way it always did in the desert. Not gradually, but all at once. darkness surrendering to light with the kind of totality that left no room for twilight negotiation. Garrett had been awake for 3 hours monitoring his patient's vitals remotely while pretending to organize supply closets that didn't need organizing. Old habits from field medicine. When you had someone in recovery, sleep became optional until you were certain they'd wake up. She woke at 6:47 a.m. He knew because the monitoring system chimed softly when her heart rate shifted from sleep patterns to waking consciousness. By the time he reached the recovery room door, she was already sitting up, testing her range of motion with the methodical precision of someone cataloging damage. "Good morning," Garrett said from the doorway. "How's the pain?" "Manageable." She touched the bandages on her side, carefully probing for weakness. "Your medication is effective." "That's generally the goal." He moved to check the monitors, noting healing rates that exceeded even the optimistic projections his database had suggested. "You're recovering faster than expected. Aylar physiology is impressive. We evolved on a planet with higher gravity and more predators. Fast healing was survival." "Useful trait." She was watching him again. That evaluating gaze that seemed to see through surface presentations to the mechanisms beneath. "You slept in your office," she observed. "How did you know?" "Your shirt has the creases of someone who fell asleep in a chair. Your hair has the pattern of someone who ran fingers through it repeatedly, and there's a coffee stain on your sleeve that wasn't there last night." Garrett glanced down at his sleeve. She was right about the coffee stain. Observant. Necessary. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, testing weight distribution. "In my line of work, missing details means dying." "And what line of work is that?" She met his eyes, waiting to see if he'd press for information he'd claimed not to care about. Garrett shrugged. "That was a polite conversation started, not an interrogation. You don't have to answer." Something in her expression shifted. Relief again mixed with what might have been surprise. "I appreciate that." "Can you stand?" She could, though it cost her effort she tried to hide. Soldiers and their pride. Garrett had learned long ago not to comment on it. Let them have their dignity. It was often all they had left. "I'm going to check your sutures," he said. "If you tore any overnight, we'll need to address it before infection sets in." "I didn't tear them." "Humor me. I'm professionally paranoid about wound integrity." She allowed the examination with the same controlled stillness she'd maintained during initial treatment. Garrett worked efficiently, checking each suture site, monitoring for signs of inflammation or rejection. Everything looked good, better than good. The tissue regeneration was proceeding at rates that would make human surgeons weep with envy. "You heal like someone designed by engineers," he observed, close enough to the truth. She watched his hands move across her injuries without flinching. "You have good technique. Military training. Army medic. Did my time overseas decided I preferred patients who weren't getting shot at while I worked on them. Went out 8 years ago, 2066, Middle East theater operations." He finished the examination and stepped back satisfied. "Everything looks clean. Another day or two, and you'll be mobile enough to ignore my advice about rest." "You assume I'll ignore it." "You're a soldier, it's genetically encoded." That earned him another almost smile. "Progress." "I should do exercises," she said. "Maintain muscle tone during recovery." "No, I need to." "No." Garrett's voice carried the flat authority of someone who'd had this argument countless times and won through sheer stubborn consistency. "You need to let your intercostal muscles knit properly. You need to give your body time to allocate resources to healing instead of movement. You need to sit still for 72 hours minimum." 72 hours? She said it like he'd suggested 72 years. 3 days, he confirmed. "I know it seems like an eternity for someone used to action, but if you tear those sutures doing morning calisthenics, we're back to square one, only with added infection risk. My enemies won't wait 3 days. Your enemies aren't in my clinic." He began gathering the examination supplies, movements automatic. "And if they show up, I have a very intimidating medical procedure in progress sign." It blinks. Her expression suggested she was reconsidering her opinion of his sanity. "You're not taking this seriously." "I'm taking your recovery very seriously. Your paranoia is what I'm not taking seriously." He disposed of used materials and washed his hands. "Although I'll admit, for someone supposedly running from powerful enemies, You're staying in one place remarkably long. She was quiet, the kind of silence that meant thinking about things she didn't want to say. Garrett had learned to recognize those silences. They usually preceded either violence or honesty, and on a frontier station you learn to hope for the latter. Your clinic is quiet, she finally said. That's what happens when you set up shop at the edge of nowhere. Low patient volume, high peace and quiet. He dried his hands on a towel that had seen better days. Also, low profit, low excitement, and a constant smell of recycled air. But you take what you can get. I meant it's peaceful. Garrett paused, looked at her properly. There was something in her expression he hadn't seen before. Not vulnerability exactly, but a kind of weariness that went deeper than physical wounds. Are you staying because you're still weak, he asked quietly, or because you don't want to leave? Both. The honesty in that single word landed between them like something fragile. I've been running for 6 weeks. She continued, her voice carrying a weight that suggested confession. Before that, I was commanding defensive perimeters for the Aylar Coalition's Third Fleet. Before that, negotiating peace treaties. Before that, fighting in frontier wars. She met his eyes. I haven't been still in 4 years. Then being still is underrated, Garrett said. Also medically necessary when recovering from stab wounds. But I might have mentioned that already. She almost laughed. Almost. 17 times, she said. You've mentioned it 17 times. Only 17 I'm slipping. This time she did laugh. The sound filled the small recovery room with something that felt almost like normalcy. Like two people having a conversation instead of a medic and a patient dancing around unspoken dangers. Garrett moved toward the door, then paused. I'm going to make coffee, he said. It's going to be terrible. You're welcome to join me if you can walk that far without tearing anything important. How terrible? Legendarily so. I've had patients request stronger pain medication after trying it. She stood slowly testing her balance. Better than yesterday, her body remembering how to distribute weight without agony. I'll risk it, she said. They made their way to the clinic's small kitchen area at a pace that respected her healing while preserving her dignity. Garrett noticed she kept her hand near the wall ready to steady herself, but didn't actually touch it. Pride again. He pretended not to notice. The coffee maker gurgled to life with sounds that suggested mechanical suffering. Garrett had owned it for 6 years, and it had sounded like that from day one. He suspected it would continue sounding like that until either he died or it did, whichever came first. This machine hates me, he observed, watching dark liquid dribble into the pot with aggressive reluctance. Perhaps it's trying to save people from the coffee. The machine has no conscience. If it did, it would have quit years ago. He poured 2 cups, both of which looked like they could strip paint. Handed one to Celine, kept the other for himself. She took a sip. Her expression suggested immediate regret. You weren't exaggerating, she said. I never do, about coffee or medical advice. He tried his own cup, managed not to grimace, barely, although people ignore both with equal enthusiasm. And they stood in the small kitchen, drinking terrible coffee while morning light filtered through windows that needed cleaning. Outside, the desert was already beginning to heat up, temperature rising toward the kind of numbers that made staying indoors a survival strategy. Can I ask you something? Celine said after a long silence. You can ask. I reserve the right not to answer. Fair enough. She studied her coffee like it might contain answers. Why aren't you asking who I am? What I did. Why people are hunting me. Garrett considered his response carefully. I worked military medicine for 8 years, he said finally. Saw combat in 3 different theaters. Patched up soldiers from both sides of conflicts I still don't fully understand. Spent most of my time wishing people would just stop shooting each other long enough for me to do my job. He set down his cup. I came out here specifically because I was tired of caring about politics and power and who was paying whom to kill whom. I just wanted to fix people. He looked at her directly. So no, Commander. I'm not interested in your history or your enemies or your political complications. I'm interested in making sure your sutures hold. She stared at him, something shifting in her expression that he couldn't quite read. You know who I am, she said. Not a question. I read news feeds, hard to miss coverage of the coalition's greatest strategic mind. And you're still... Treating you like a patient, yes. He picked up his coffee again. That bothers you. I don't know what it does to me. She touched the bandages on her side absently. People don't usually. They either fear me or they want to use me. They hold ceremonies. They ask for advice. They want me to inspire troops or terrify enemies. Her fingers traced the edge of the bandages. No one just treats me like I'm ordinary. Garrett felt something shift in his understanding of the woman in front of him. That sounds exhausting, he said quietly. It is. The admission seemed to surprise her as much as it surprised him. Being Commander Celine means every conversation has weight, she continued. Every decision affects thousands of lives. Every appearance is calculated for political impact. She looked at him with those sunset-colored eyes. But here you argued with me about doing exercises. You threatened to sedate me if I didn't rest. You charged me as standard rates for medical treatment. Should I have charged more, I can recalculate if you're feeling undervalued. That startled a laugh from her, real and unguarded. You're doing it again, she said. Doing what? Treating me like I'm just another stubborn patient refusing to follow medical advice. Well, Garrett said reasonably, you are a stubborn patient refusing to follow medical advice. The commander of the Aylar Defense Coalition part doesn't really change the fact that you keep wanting to tear your stitches. She stood there in his small kitchen, drinking terrible coffee, and for the first time since falling through his door, she smiled. Not the controlled expression of someone maintaining composure. A genuine smile that reached her eyes and transformed her face into something younger than her apparent years. I think I like it here, she said softly. Don't get too attached. The coffee doesn't get better. I'll manage. Outside, the desert sun climbed higher, burning away the recycled rain, leaving the outpost clean and dry and hot. Inside the clinic, two people stood drinking bad coffee and not talking about the future or the past or the dangers that would eventually arrive. Just standing in a kitchen being ordinary. And for Celine, that was extraordinary enough. Day 4 arrived with the particular quality of light that belonged only to desert mornings, clean and sharp and merciless in its clarity. Celine woke before dawn, as she always did, her internal chronometer calibrated to military schedules that didn't recognize concepts like sleeping in or rest days. For a moment in that space between sleep and waking, she reached for her tactical display before remembering it wasn't there. Hadn't been there for 6 weeks. Then she remembered where she was. A recovery room in a frontier clinic. Bandages instead of armor. Silence instead of command briefings. A human medic who made terrible coffee and treated legendary warriors like they were ordinary patients who talked too much about exercises. She touched the sutures on her side. Garrett's work was impeccable. The wounds that should have taken weeks to close were already knitting her Aylar physiology, working in concert with his technique to achieve healing that would have seemed miraculous to most species. But then her people had needed to be hard to kill. Evolution on a world where everything wanted to eat you tended toward resilience or extinction. She stood testing her balance. Better, good enough. The clinic was quiet around her. Through the thin walls, she could hear Garrett moving in his office. The soft sounds of someone who'd learned to be awake without making noise about it. Another soldier's habit. Another mark of the war he claimed to have left behind, but clearly still carried. Celine found herself wondering what he'd seen in those Middle East operations. What had driven a competent medic out of service and into the self-imposed exile at the edge of human settlement? What made a man choose healing over everything else? She moved to the recovery room's small window and looked out over the outpost. Prefabricated structures clustered against the desert like humanity insisting on existing in places that didn't want them. It reminded her of forward operating bases she'd commanded. That same quality of temporary permanence. Of people making homes in places they knew wouldn't last. But there was something else here too. Something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not the absence of conflict which she'd known in brief moments between battles, but actual peace. The kind that settled into bones and made breathing feel easier. The kind she'd forgotten existed. A soft knock on the door frame interrupted her thoughts. You're awake early, Garrett said from the doorway. That's either good healing or bad sleeping. Both probably. Fair assessment. He had 2 cups of coffee, offered her one. Thought you might need this, or want to suffer through it. I'm never sure which applies with my coffee. Celine took the cup, sipped it, still terrible, still somehow comforting. I want to help, she said. Garrett raised an eyebrow. Help with what? Around the clinic, organizing, cleaning, whatever needs doing. She gestured at herself at the bandages and the borrowed clothes and the fact of her standing there accepting charity. I can't just rest. I need to be useful. You're recovering from major trauma. Being useful is healing without complicating my medical work. Please. The word came out more vulnerable than she'd intended. Garrett's expression shifted, understanding crossing his features. You need to feel like you're contributing, he said quietly, not just taking up space. Yes. He considered for a long moment, then nodded. Supply closet needs organizing. Inventory system hasn't been updated in 6 months. If you can handle that without tearing stitches, it's yours. Relief flooded through her. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. My organization system is what professionals call aggressively random. You might regret volunteering. He wasn't wrong about the organization system. Celine stood in the supply closet 2 hours later, surrounded by medical equipment that seemed to have been stored according to a system only Garrett could understand. Bandages next to diagnostic tools next to spare parts for machines she couldn't identify. Everything technically accessible, nothing actually organized. It was a mess. She loved it. For the first time in 4 years, she was doing something that had absolutely no strategic importance. No one's life depended on whether she put the antiseptic on the left shelf or the right. No diplomatic relations would crumble if she categorized the surgical tools by function instead of alphabetically. It was gloriously, wonderfully meaningless. And in that meaninglessness, she found something she'd lost. Freedom. How's it going? Garrett appeared in the doorway, looking at the organized chaos she was creating. Your system is innovative, Celine said diplomatically, by which I mean completely nonsensical. I know where everything is, that's what matters. You know where everything is because you put it there. What happens if someone else needs to find supplies? They ask me, what if you're not here? Then they're having a very bad day that's about to get worse. Celine shook her head, but she was smiling. I'm reorganizing by category and frequency of use. Common items front and center. Specialized equipment labeled and inventoried. You're bringing military efficiency to my medical supplies. Someone needs to. He leaned against the door frame, watching her work with an expression she couldn't quite read. You're good at this, he observed. Organizing supplies. Finding purpose in small tasks. Not everyone can do that, especially people used to commanding fleets. Celine paused, a box of sterile bandages in her hands. When you've been responsible for 10,000 lives, she said quietly, there's something beautiful about being responsible for bandages. The stakes are manageable. The outcomes are predictable. And if you make a mistake, the worst that happens is someone has to look harder for antiseptic. Garrett nodded slowly. No one dies. No one dies. They stood there in the small supply closet surrounded by medical equipment and the weight of what they weren't saying. All the times people had died. All the decisions that couldn't be unmade. All the weight that came with being responsible for more than bandages and antiseptic. I'm making lunch, Garrett said finally. Sandwiches. They'll be mediocre but edible. You're welcome to join me. I'd like that. The afternoon passed in a rhythm that felt almost domestic. Celine organized while Garrett saw patients. A spacer with a broken finger. A prospector with heat exhaustion. A child from the outpost who needed vaccination updates. Regular people with regular problems that Garrett treated with the same careful competence he'd shown when treating a wounded Aylar commander. Watching him work, Celine began to understand. This was what he'd meant about not caring who someone was. It wasn't dismissiveness or lack of interest. It was something deeper. A fundamental belief that everyone deserved the same quality of care, regardless of rank or species or the size of the bounty on their head. It was, she realized, integrity. The kind that couldn't be compromised or negotiated or set aside when inconvenient. The kind she'd thought existed only in idealistic speeches and propaganda broadcasts. By evening, she'd reorganized half the supply closet and eaten a sandwich that was exactly as mediocre as promised. She'd also watched Garrett treat 7 patients with perfect professionalism, help sterilize equipment she could now find without asking, and made coffee that was somehow worse than his. How did you make it worse? Garrett stared at his cup with genuine bewilderment. I have a gift. That's not the word I'd use. Celine laughed and the sound surprised her. When had laughter become so rare that it felt foreign in her own throat? 4 years ago, she realized. When she'd accepted command and learned that commanders don't laugh. They inspire, they intimidate, they calculate and strategize and project strength, but they don't laugh over terrible coffee in a frontier clinic. I should check your sutures, Garrett said, setting down his undrinkable coffee. Make sure the organizing didn't undo my work. In the examination room under bright medical lights, Celine submitted to his inspection with the same controlled stillness she'd maintained before, but something had shifted. The vulnerability felt less like weakness and more like trust. Healing well, Garrett confirmed. Another day and you'll be mobile enough to ignore me completely. I don't ignore you. You're planning to ignore me. I can see it in your eyes. You're already thinking about exercises. He was right, which was annoying. I need to maintain conditioning, she protested. You need to maintain not dying from infected wounds. We can discuss conditioning when your body finishes remembering how to be intact. You're very stubborn. Professional hazard comes from treating stubborn patients. He washed his hands back to her. Also comes from losing patients who wouldn't listen. The weight in those words made Celine pause. In the Middle East, she asked quietly, and other places. He dried his hands with mechanical precision. You learn fast in combat medicine. Listen to the doctor or become a statistic. Most listen, some don't. And the ones who don't, I remember their names. Celine understood. She carried 300 names. He carried his own list. Different wars, different worlds, same weight. I'll rest, she said. Another day, if only to avoid being added to your list. I appreciate that. That night, Celine lay in the recovery room bed and stared at the ceiling. Her body was healing. Her wounds were closing. In a few days, she'd be mobile enough to leave. The thought should have brought relief. Instead, it brought something that felt uncomfortably like grief. She'd been running for 6 weeks, driven by survival instinct and the bone-deep need to escape, to get far enough away that the people hunting her couldn't find her, to buy time to figure out what to do when your own government wants you dead. But here in this quiet clinic, with its terrible coffee and stubborn medic, she'd stopped running, and she didn't want to start again. Day 5 began with a mistake. Celine woke at 5:17 a.m., her body clock refusing to acknowledge concepts like recovery or rest. The wounds on her side pulled when she sat up, but not painfully. More like reminders than protests. She stood, tested her range of motion. Good. Better than yesterday. Good enough, her soldier's brain suggested, for light exercises. She should have known better. Should have remembered Garrett's warnings about intercostal muscles and suture integrity and the difference between feeling better and being healed. But 4 years of military discipline spoke louder than 3 days of medical advice. The exercises started simple. Stretches, basic movements to maintain flexibility, nothing that should stress the wounds. Should being the operative word, she was midway through a core rotation when she felt it. A sharp pull in her left side. Not quite pain, not quite normal. The specific sensation of something that had been holding together deciding it no longer wanted to. Celine looked down. Red was seeping through her shirt. Damn it, she muttered. I could have told you that was a bad idea. Garrett's voice came from the doorway. In fact, I'm fairly certain I did tell you. Multiple times. She turned to face him, hand pressed against the torn suture, feeling sheepish and frustrated in equal measure. You thought you were healed enough. You weren't. He moved into the room with the calm efficiency of someone who dealt with this exact scenario more times than he could count. Examination room, now, for you bleed on the carpet and I have to charge you a cleaning fee on top of medical fees. I'm sorry. Save the apologies for after I fix this. But his voice carried no real anger. Just the weary patience of a medic who'd learned that soldiers were going to soldier, regardless of medical advice. In the examination room, Garrett cut away the bandages with practiced precision, revealing the damage Celine had done to his careful work. 1 suture torn completely, 2 more stressed. He began cleaning the wound, his touch impersonal and efficient. Could have been worse. Your Ayler healing kept it from being a complete disaster. I should have listened. Yes. He threaded a fresh suture. You should have. But you didn't because you're a soldier and soldiers have a genetic compulsion to ignore medical professionals. It's practically in your DNA. You're not angry. I'm resigned. There's a difference. He worked in silence for a moment, then added quietly, I've treated enough soldiers to know that asking you not to exercise is like asking the desert not to be hot. Doesn't mean I won't keep trying. Celine watched him work, feeling something shift in her chest. Not pain, something else. Gratitude maybe, or the beginning of understanding what it meant to be cared for without judgment. Why did you leave military service, she asked. Garrett's hands paused, just for a second, then resumed their work. That's a complicated question. I have time, and I'm not going anywhere until you finish. He was quiet for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he set down his instruments and met her eyes. 2066, he said. Field hospital outside a city I still can't pronounce. We had a VIP come through. Diplomat's son, important family. He'd been hit by shrapnel, major internal bleeding. Needed immediate surgery. Garrett's jaw tightened. My commanding officer told me to wait. Said a specialist was coming from the main base. I said the patient would be dead in 20 minutes. He said those were my orders. Celine felt cold understanding settling in her chest. You waited, she said quietly. I waited. The specialist arrived 30 minutes later. The patient was already gone. Garrett's voice was flat, emotionless, the tone of someone reciting facts too painful to feel. Command asked me to sign a report saying we'd done everything possible, that the wounds were too severe, that no intervention could have saved him. And you refused. I refused, told them exactly what happened, that politics killed that man, not shrapnel. He looked at her. They gave me a choice. Sign the report and keep my career, or tell the truth and get discharged. You chose truth. I chose to never again let someone's rank or position determine whether they got treatment. He went back to suturing. That's why I don't care who you are, Celine, because the moment I start caring about who someone is, I become the kind of medic who lets people die for politics. Celine sat in stunned silence. This man, this stubborn human who made terrible coffee and yelled about stitches, had sacrificed his career for integrity, had walked away from everything because he couldn't compromise on the fundamental truth that everyone deserved equal care, had seen her not as Commander Celine worth 50 million credits, but as a patient who needed help. You saw what I needed, she said quietly. I saw someone exhausted, someone who needed rest, not just physical. He tied off the suture. Was I wrong? No. The word came out thick with emotion she couldn't quite name. You weren't wrong. He finished the work in silence, applying fresh bandages with the same meticulous care he'd shown 3 days ago. When he was done, he stepped back and fixed her with a look that carried weight. No more exercises, he said. Not for another 48 hours minimum. And this time I mean it. Next time you tear these stitches, I'm sedating you for your own good. Understood. I mean it, Celine. I know, I'll behave. That's what you said last time. This time I mean it. Garrett sighed, but she saw the hint of a smile at the corner of his mouth. Get some rest. Real rest. The kind where you actually lie down and don't do anything productive. That sounds boring. That sounds like healing. There's a difference on Bamin. The tablet was old military surplus, the kind that had been standard issue in 2068 and obsolete by 2070. Celine recognized it because she'd carried one like it during her early command years, before coalition technology had caught up to Ayler standards, before integration had meant better equipment and worse politics. She found it in Garrett's office late that evening when she went looking for something to read. It was sitting on his desk, screen active, displaying a news feed she recognized. Coalition military updates. Her file was open. Commander Celine, strategic advisor to the Ayler Defense Coalition, architect of the Kai's Gate defense. Current status: missing, presumed captured, or dead. Corvath syndicate bounty, 50 million credits. Her official portrait stared back at her from the screen. The one they'd taken after Kai's Gate. She looked different in it. Harder. The kind of hard that came from making choices that saved thousands and killed hundreds. The kind of hard that made politicians nervous and enemies determined. Garrett had known. From the beginning, he'd known exactly who she was. The door opened behind her. I was wondering when you'd find that, Garrett said quietly. Celine turned. He stood in the doorway, coffee cup in hand, expression neutral. Not guilty, not defensive. Just watching her with that same steady regard he'd shown since she'd fallen through his door. You knew, she said, from the beginning. Suspected day one, confirmed day two. He moved into the office, set his coffee down. Your description matched reports. The wounds matched plasma weapons. And ALER commanders don't usually collapse into random frontier clinics unless they're running from something serious. The bounty is a lot of money, enough to retire comfortably, buy a nicer clinic, maybe even get a coffee maker that doesn't hate me. Then why didn't I turn you in? He met her eyes. Because you didn't want to be Commander Celine. You wanted to be a patient who needed help. I gave you that. The simple honesty in his words hit harder than she'd expected. I don't understand, Celine said. Everyone wants something. Money, favor, influence. You could have, didn't want to. Garrett picked up his coffee again, sipped it despite its temperature. You want to talk about why you are really still here, or should we keep dancing around it? Celine sat down slowly, made a choice to trust him with more than her wounds. Kai's gate, she began. The story came slowly, painfully, like extracting shrapnel from deep tissue. But Garrett listened the way he did everything, with complete attention, without judgment, just present and bearing witness to words that had never been spoken aloud. Kai's gate had been a defensive position at the edge of coalition space, strategic importance that outweighed its actual value. The kind of place that mattered, because losing it would mean losing everything behind it. Celine had been given command with orders that were clear. Hold the gate, no matter the cost. The Korvath forces had come in overwhelming numbers. Wave after wave of ships and soldiers and weapons that turned the void into burning chaos. For 3 days, coalition forces had held. Barely, desperately. On the 4th day, Celine had seen the pattern. The attack vectors. The way Korvath forces committed to engagements. She'd seen the opportunity. A risky maneuver. Tactical genius or suicidal gambit, depending on execution. She'd need to pull defensive forces from 3 critical positions, create a gap that would look like weakness, lure the enemy into overcommitting, then collapse the trap. It would work. She knew it would work. It would also cost lives. The forces she pulled from those defensive positions would be vulnerable. Some wouldn't survive the repositioning. She'd done the math. 300 lives against 10,000. The choice had been strategic, logical, necessary. It had also been the hardest thing she'd ever done. I gave the orders, Celine said, her voice hollow, pulled forces from defensive emplacements, soldiers who'd held their positions for 3 days, told them to reposition for offensive maneuver. Garrett listened, silent, present. They followed orders because they trusted me, because I was Commander Celine who'd never led them wrong. She closed her eyes. The maneuver worked. Korvath committed to the gap. We collapsed the trap. 10,000 coalition soldiers survived. We held Kai's gate. And 300 didn't make it to the repositioning. 300 didn't make it. Celine opened her eyes. They gave me a medal, held ceremonies, called it the Serpent's Gambit, called me a strategic genius, called it acceptable losses. But you memorized their names. Every single one. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs. Private Thalin, Corporal Mesri, Lieutenant Kavan, who just made rank. 300 names, I can recite them all. Have you, Garrett asked quietly, every night for 6 weeks since I started running? She looked at him. Do you know what the worst part is? I'd make the same choice again. 300 for 10,000. The math is clear. The strategy was sound. I'd do it exactly the same. But you'd still mourn them. Yes. That's the difference, Garrett said, between a commander and a monster. Monsters don't remember names. Celine felt something break inside her chest, something that had been held rigid for 4 years, refusing to bend, refusing to acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, grief and duty could coexist. They wanted me to forget, she said, the coalition. After the ceremony, after the medals, they wanted me to move on. Accept that losses happen. Focus on the victory. But you couldn't. I couldn't. She touched her bandaged side, feeling the wounds beneath. And then I discovered the betrayal. found evidence that council members were negotiating with Earth corporations, selling coalition military technology, using victories like Kai's Gate to drive up value. Garrett's expression darkened. They were profiting from the war. Yes, and when I threatened to expose them when I said I'd testify before the full assembly, Celine's laugh was bitter. Suddenly I became inconvenient, a hero who wouldn't stay quiet, an asset that had outlived its usefulness. So they sent Corvath. Easier than a public trial, easier than letting me speak. Just make the problematic commander disappear and blame it on war casualties. She met his eyes. That's why I ran, not just from assassins, from my own government, from the people I'd served for 4 years. And now I don't know what I am, not Commander Celine anymore, not part of the coalition, just running, existing day to day, waiting for the inevitable. Garrett stood, moved to the window, looked out at the desert that stretched endless and indifferent beyond the clinic walls. You know what I think, he said. What? I think you're still Commander Celine. You're just also Celine who makes terrible coffee and organizes supply closets. Both can be true. How? Same way I'm both the medic who lost his career for honesty and Garrett who runs a frontier clinic. We're all multiple things. He turned back to face her. The question isn't who you are, it's who you choose to be now. Before Celine could respond, Garrett's communication tablet chimed. He glanced at it and his expression shifted. What is it? Celine asked. Encrypted message, coalition frequency. He looked at her. Do you want me to open it? Celine's heart hammered. Coalition communications meant they'd found her, meant the peace of this small clinic was ending, meant choices were coming whether she was ready or not. Open it, she said. The holographic display activated, showing a face Celine recognized immediately. General Thane, her second in command for 3 years. The woman who'd stood beside her at Kai's Gate, who'd helped implement the Serpent's Gambit, who'd been there for all of it. Commander Thane's recorded message began, I know you're alive. I know you're hiding, and I know you think you can't trust the coalition anymore. Thane's expression was grim. You're right not to trust them. The betrayal goes deeper than you know. But there are those of us still loyal, those of us who've been gathering evidence, working quietly. The general paused. I've found proof, names, transactions, everything. Enough to bring charges, enough to clean coalition command of the corruption that tried to kill you. But I need you, Celine. I need you to come back, to testify, to help us rebuild what they tried to destroy. Another pause. I can have an extraction team at your location within 48 hours of receiving confirmation. Just send the signal. We'll bring you home. The message ended. Silence filled the office. Well, Garrett said quietly, that's a choice. Celine stared at the blank display where Thane's face had been. 48 hours? 2 days. Then back to the coalition. Back to being Commander Celine. Back to the weight and the responsibility and the endless calculations of who lives and who dies. Back to everything she'd been running from. Or she could stay running, stay hidden, stay in this quiet clinic where the biggest responsibility was organizing bandages and drinking terrible coffee. Stay being just Celine. I don't know what I want, she said. What does Celine want? Garrett asked. Not Commander, just Celine. What do you want? The question landed like a blade between ribs. When had anyone last asked what she wanted? Not what the coalition needed. Not what strategy demanded. Not what duty required. What she wanted. Celine stood, walked to the window, looked out at the same desert Garrett had been watching. Endless, empty, free. I want, she paused, started again. I want to not carry 300 names alone anymore. I want someone to understand that victory and grief aren't opposites, that you can make the right choice and still mourn the cost. She turned to face Garrett. I want what I found here, someone who sees me, not the legend, not the strategic asset, just me. You have that, Garrett said simply. For how long? 48 hours, 3 days. Eventually Corvath finds me, or coalition forces me to choose, or something else happens. This peace is temporary. All peace is temporary. Doesn't make it less real. Celine felt tears threatening. pushed them back with the discipline of 4 years commanding fleets. I ran because I felt trapped, she said. Trapped by duty and expectations and the weight of being who everyone needed me to be. I thought running meant freedom. And I was wrong. The admission hurt. Freedom isn't running. Freedom is choosing. I ran from choices. That's not freedom. That's just being lost. Garrett nodded slowly, understanding crossing his features. So what do you choose? He asked. Celine looked at him. This stubborn human who'd sacrificed everything for integrity, who made terrible coffee and treated legendary warriors like ordinary patients, who'd given her a gift more valuable than safety. He'd given her space to remember who she was beneath the rank. I choose to go back, she said. The words felt right, solid. Not because I have to, because I want to, because Thane is right. The coalition needs cleaning. Those 300 soldiers deserve justice, not just my grief. She moved closer to Garrett, but I'm not going back as the same person. I'm going back as Celine, who is also commander. Who knows that mourning and leading aren't contradictions? Who understands that being human or Aylar matters more than being legendary? That sounds like wisdom. That sounds like something I learned from a stubborn medic. She managed a smile. You taught me that seeing someone as ordinary is the highest form of respect. I'm taking that lesson back with me. Good, Garrett said. The coalition could use more leaders who remember people are ordinary. He moved to his communication console. I'll help you send the confirmation to Thane. 48 hours means they'll be here day after tomorrow. Garrett. Yes, thank you, Celine said quietly, for seeing me. He looked at her and something in his expression softened. You're welcome, Celine. Now let's get that message sent. And then we're going to make sure you're healed enough to survive whatever comes next. She laughed, actually laughed. The sound filling the small office was something that felt like hope. Outside, the desert sun was setting, painting the sky in colors that reminded Garrett of her eyes. Inside, two people who'd learned that choices mattered more than circumstances began preparing for whatever came next. Together. For 48 more hours. It would have to be enough. The attack came at 2:14 a.m. Garrett woke to proximity alarms, screaming, his body moving before his mind fully processed the threat. Military training never really left. It just waited dormant for the moment when survival meant not thinking, just acting. He was pulling on pants when his tactical display lit up with threat assessment. 3 vehicles, modified SUVs with armor plating and weapon systems that had no business being on civilian transports. Approaching from the east at high speed. Heat signatures suggested 12 to 15 occupants. Korvath Syndicate. They'd found her. But they weren't supposed to be here for another day and a half. Celine had only sent the confirmation to Thane 6 hours ago. Coalition extraction was still 42 hours out, which meant either Korvath had better intelligence than expected or someone had leaked the extraction timeline. Neither thought was comforting. Garrett grabbed his medical tablet, routed the alarm to Celine's room, and was moving before the system finished its threat analysis. He found her in the corridor, already dressed, already armed with blades he hadn't known she'd kept hidden. Of course, she'd kept weapons. She was a soldier. Soldiers were never truly unarmed. How many? She asked. Calm, focused. This was Commander Celine now, the strategic mind that had won Kai's Gate. 12 minimum, possibly 15. Heavy weapons, professional team. Korvath doesn't send amateurs. She moved to the window, assessed approach vectors with the speed of someone who'd done this calculation 1,000 times. They'll breach main entrance and send secondary team through the service access. Standard assault protocol. We can't fight 15 trained operatives. We don't have to fight them. Celine turned to him, and her expression was fierce, determined. We just have to survive long enough for coalition extraction. That's 42 hours away. I know. She pulled out the small communication device she'd used to contact Thane, started broadcasting emergency signal. But Thane will move faster when she gets this. We just need to hold out, buy time. How much time? However long it takes. Garrett's mind shifted into tactical mode, the same space he'd occupied in field hospitals under fire, where panic became protocol and fear became fuel. Medical lockdown, he said. This clinic has quarantine protocols, containment fields designed for biological threats. We can trap half their team if we time it right. Celine's eyes lit with understanding. Funnel them into kill zones. Use their tactics against them. Exactly. They moved through the clinic with synchronized precision. Garrett activating security measures while Celine positioned herself at strategic points. They had maybe 5 minutes before breach. Maybe less. Garrett, Celine said as he finished setting the last containment field trigger. Yes. Thank you for everything. Save the gratitude for after we survive. No, she caught his arm. Made him look at her. I need to say this now in case I don't get another chance. Celine, you gave me back myself. Whatever happens next, that matters. You matter. Before he could respond, the main entrance exploded inward, plasma charges turning reinforced security doors into molten slag. Korvath operatives poured through the breach with military precision weapons, raised scanning for targets, with the efficiency of people who killed for a living. Garrett waited until exactly 6 of them were in the treatment room. Then he triggered the lockdown. The containment field snapped into place with a sound like reality tearing. Energy barriers designed to contain infectious diseases now imprisoned half the assault team in a bubble of hardened light that their weapons couldn't penetrate. They started firing immediately, plasma bolts splashing against the field like rain against glass. Garrett activated the clinic's intercom. Medical quarantine protocols are now in effect, he announced with perfect professional calm. You're in violation of approximately 17 health codes. Please cease hostile actions or I'll be forced to file a formal complaint. One of the trapped operatives said something extremely explicit about Garrett's complaint. Well, Garrett muttered, that's just rude. The remaining operatives had already split half moving to free their trapped companions, half advancing deeper into the clinic, advancing towards Celine. She met them in the corridor with the kind of violence that reminded Garrett exactly why the Coalition had made her a commander. Her blades flashed in emergency lighting, alien martial arts that looked like dancing and killed like poetry. She moved through the operatives with devastating efficiency, turning their numbers against them in the confined space. Garrett triggered his second defense. The clinic's fire suppression system reprogrammed to release a harmless but profoundly disorienting gas mixture. Medical-grade smoke essentially designed to blind tactical visors and overwhelm sensory systems. The operatives stumbled, their expensive technology suddenly useless. Celine capitalized without hesitation. Garrett watched her fight for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to confirm she was terrifyingly competent, then focused on his role. Keeping containment fields stable, managing environmental systems, making sure the clinic's structure didn't collapse from plasma scoring and combat damage. The fight lasted 7 minutes. It felt like hours. When it ended, 12 Korvath operatives were unconscious or restrained. The clinic looked like a war zone, and Celine stood in the center of it all, breathing hard, but steady, blood on her blades and determination in her eyes. You're bleeding, Garrett said, seeing fresh red seeping through her shirt. Torn suture. She didn't look concerned. Minor. That's the second time. He moved toward her with medical supplies already in hand. We just fixed those yesterday. I was protecting what matters. She met his eyes. No regrets. Despite everything, the destroyed clinic, the unconscious assassins, the certainly ruined insurance claim, he'd have to file. Garrett smiled. Sit down, he said. Let's fix those stitches. Again. She came to him, this legendary warrior who just defeated professional killers and submitted to his medical care with the same trust she'd shown from the beginning. Outside, desert dawn was beginning to break. Inside, Garrett worked on Celine's wounds, while around them, the evidence of violence slowly settled into silence. How long until Coalition extraction? He asked, suturing with practiced precision. Thane responded to the emergency signal. 12 hours, maybe less if she pushes the engines. Think we can stay boring for 12 hours? With our luck, probably not. Then I guess we'll handle whatever comes next. Together. Together, Garrett confirmed. And in the growing light of a Nevada morning surrounded by the wreckage of their temporary peace, 2 people who'd learned that ordinary moments mattered more than legendary ones prepared for whatever came next. Together. For as long as they had left. The Coalition dropship descended from the Nevada sky at 11:23 a.m., its hull reflecting sunlight in ways that hurt to look at directly. Aylar engineering. Technology that made Earth's best spacecraft look like museum pieces. Garrett stood in the clinic's doorway, watching the ship settle onto the desert hardpan with the kind of precision that spoke of AI-assisted landing protocols and pilots who'd logged more flight hours than most humans lived years. Beside him, Celine stood perfectly still, combat ready, commander ready. She'd changed in the 8 hours since the Corvath assault. Not physically, though Garrett had resutured her wounds for the second time, with increasingly pointed commentary about following medical advice. But something in her bearing had shifted. The relaxed quality she'd developed over days of organizing supplies and drinking terrible coffee had been replaced by military posture. She was putting the armor back on. Garrett understood. You didn't face your former command wearing vulnerability. You wore strength, even if it was a mask over exhaustion. The dropship's ramp descended with hydraulic precision. 6 Aylar soldiers emerged, first weapons ready, establishing a security perimeter with the kind of synchronized movement that spoke of elite training. Coalition Special Operations. If Garrett's recognition of tactical formations still held true. Then came General Thane. She was tall even for an Aylar, silver streaked through dark hair in patterns that suggested age and wisdom in equal measure. Her uniform carried enough insignia to make Garrett's old military instincts catalog her as someone who'd earned rank through competence rather than politics. She stopped 3 meters from Celine, studied her with eyes that saw too much. Commander, Thane said. Her voice carried the weight of someone who'd spent years giving orders and having them followed without question. General, Celine replied, formal, controlled. They stood facing each other, while the desert wind moved between them, carrying heat and silence in equal measure. Then Thane's expression cracked. You look different, she said quietly. I've been recovering. That's not what I mean. Thane moved closer, her tactical assessment shifting to something more personal. You look lighter, less weighted. Celine glanced at Garrett. Something passed between them that Thane noticed but didn't comment on. I had good medical care, Celine said. Apparently. Thane turned her attention to Garrett for the first time. You're the human who's been sheltering her. I'm the doctor who's been treating her, Garrett corrected. Same words he'd used before, same fundamental truth. There's a difference. Thane's expression shifted. Surprise, maybe? Or recognition of someone who understood distinctions that mattered. I'm General Thane, Coalition Defense Forces. She extended a hand in the human custom. You have my gratitude for keeping Commander Celine alive. Garrett shook her hand. Firm grip, soldier's handshake. Garrett Hollis, and she kept herself alive. I just provided medical support. He provided more than that, Celine said quietly. Thane looked between them, reading something in the dynamic that made her expression soften. I can see that, she said. One of the Coalition soldiers approached, spoke to Thane in rapid Aylar. Garrett caught maybe 1 word in 5. His translator implant was civilian grade, not military, and Aylar tactical language moved faster than standard speech. Thane nodded, responded in kind, then turned back to Celine. We need to move quickly, she said. The extraction window is narrow. Council loyalists are monitoring communications. If they realize you're alive and in Coalition custody, they'll try again, Celine finished. Yes. Then let's not give them the chance. Celine straightened and Garrett watched Commander Celine fully emerge. What's the tactical situation? They moved into the clinic, Thane's security team establishing a perimeter, while the general spread a holographic tactical display across Garrett's desk. The projection showed Star System's fleet positions, political boundaries that meant nothing to Garrett but clearly carried weight for the 2 Aylar commanders. The evidence I mentioned in my message, Thane began manipulating the display to highlight specific data points. We have transaction records, communications, proof that 3 council members conspired with Earth defense contractors to profit from extended conflict. Names, Celine's voice was ice. Councillor Vereth, Councillor Mescain, and Council Chair Thalaris. Celine's expression didn't change, but Garrett saw her hands tighten. The chair, she said, the one who gave me the medal. The same one who authorized Corvath contact 3 days later. Thane's own anger showed in clipped words. We have communications proving he knew about the assassination attempt, proving he approved it. The silence that followed carried the weight of betrayal that went beyond military conspiracy into something personal. The person who'd honored Celine's sacrifice had simultaneously ordered her death. What do you need from me? Celine asked. Testimony. Before the full Coalition assembly. You're the victim. You're also the hero of Kai's Gate. Your words carry weight that evidence alone doesn't. Thane met Celine's eyes. We need you to come back, to speak, to help us clean the corruption from Coalition Command. And if I refuse, then the conspirators win. The soldiers who died at Kai's Gate get no justice, and the Coalition continues rotting from the inside. Garrett watched Celine process this, saw the calculation happening behind her eyes, the strategic assessment of costs and benefits, risks and rewards. But he also saw something else, something new. She was considering what she wanted, not just what was needed. I'll testify, Celine said, but on one condition. Name it. The testimony happens here, now, before I leave this clinic. Celine gestured at Garrett's equipment. You have holographic communication. I'll testify remotely. The assembly can watch. The evidence can be presented. But I'm not stepping onto a coalition ship until charges are filed and the conspirators are in custody. Thane considered this. You don't trust coalition security. I don't trust anyone except the people in this room. Celine's voice carried absolute conviction. And I learned from a stubborn human that sometimes the safest place is exactly where you are. Thane looked at Garrett with renewed interest. Wise advice, she said. Common sense, Garrett corrected, which is often the same thing. Can it be arranged? Celine asked. Thane worked her communication device, speaking rapidly in Ayler. Garrett caught words that translated roughly to emergency session and immediate priority. The assembly is convening now, Thane said. We'll have a quorum in the 20 minutes. You'll testify before the full council via a holographic link. Good. Celine touched the bandages on her side. An unconscious gesture Garrett had seen her repeat countless times. Then let's finish this. They set up the holographic communication array in Garrett's office. Coalition technology interfacing with his civilian equipment in ways that made his diagnostic computers look like antiques. Celine stood in the projection field, her image simultaneously present in the clinic and being broadcast across 3 star systems to the Coalition Assembly Chamber. Garrett watched from outside the projection range. This was her moment, her testimony, her choice to reclaim her voice after 6 weeks of silence. General Thane stood beside Garrett, also watching from outside the projection. She looks different than I remember, Thane said quietly. Different how? Centered. Like she knows exactly who she is. Thane glanced at him. What did you do to her, Dr. Hollis? Treated her wounds, made terrible coffee, argued about medical advice. That's all. That's everything. Thane nodded slowly, understanding something Garrett hadn't quite articulated. In the projection field, Celine began to speak. Members of the assembly, she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd commanded fleets and won wars. I stand before you not as Commander Celine, strategic advisor and hero of Kai's Gate. I stand before you as Celine, soldier, survivor, and victim of the betrayal I'm about to expose. She presented the evidence methodically. Transaction records showing payments from Earth corporations to Coalition Council members. Communications proving knowledge of military operations being sold to defense contractors. Proof that victories like Kai's Gate had been used to inflate the value of technology being traded for personal profit. The assembly listened in growing horror. Then Celine showed the final piece. Communications between Council Chair Tholaris and Korvath Syndicate leadership, authorizing her assassination, detailing payment terms, specifying that it should look like war casualties. This is the leadership that gave me a medal, Celine said, her voice cold and precise. The same leadership that ordered my death 3 days later. Not because I was a traitor, because I threatened to expose their treason. She turned to face the 3 conspirators directly. You used the sacrifice of 300 soldiers at Kai's Gate to profit from war. You turned victory into commerce. You made heroes into commodities. Her voice dropped to something dangerous. And when I discovered your conspiracy, you tried to make me disappear. These are lies. Counselor Vareth stood, his holographic form flickering with either poor connection or rage. Fabrications designed to undermine coalition unity. The evidence speaks for itself, Thane interjected, stepping into the projection field. We have independent verification from coalition intelligence. Everything Commander Celine presents is authenticated and verified. And more, Celine continued. I'm not the only one you betrayed. Every soldier who fought believing they served honorable leadership. Every family who lost someone in conflicts you prolong for profit. Every citizen who trusted coalition government to protect them, not exploit them. She stood straighter, and Garrett saw the commander fully emerge. I propose immediate suspension of Counselors Vareth Meskan and Thalaris pending full investigation. I propose comprehensive audit of all council financial dealings for the past 5 years. And I propose that we remember something we've forgotten. The assembly waited. We are not weapons, Celine said. We are not assets or commodities or tools to be used and discarded. We are people who choose to serve, and that service deserves leadership worthy of it. She looked directly at the camera, and Garrett knew she was speaking to more than the assembly now. I learned something in the past few days, she said quietly. I learned that being treated as ordinary is the highest form of respect. That being seen as a person before being seen as a legend is the foundation of dignity. That sometimes the greatest wisdom comes not from strategy, but from simple decency. Her eyes found Garrett's through the projection field. I'm returning to coalition service, but I'm returning as Celine, who is also commander. As someone who remembers that titles serve people, not the other way around. And I expect leadership that remembers the same. The assembly erupted in discussion, holographic figures arguing, debating, processing the bombshell Celine had delivered. Thane stepped forward, calling for order, presenting formal charges against the 3 conspirators. Garrett watched it all unfold with the detachment of someone observing a world that wasn't quite his own. Coalition politics, interstellar governance, corruption at levels that made Earth-us problems look simple by comparison. But through it all, he watched Celine. She stood at the center of the storm she'd created, calm and certain and absolutely in control. This was Commander Celine at her finest. Strategic mind, political acumen, the ability to reshape entire power structures with words backed by irrefutable evidence. But she was also still Celine, the woman who'd organized his supply closet, who'd made terrible coffee, who'd learned to laugh again in a frontier clinic at the edge of nowhere. Both. She was both. And watching her, Garrett felt something he hadn't expected. Pride. The assembly session lasted 4 hours. By the end, all 3 conspirators were in coalition custody. Emergency investigations were authorized. Reform committees were being formed. The coalition government was being torn down and rebuilt in real time. And Celine stood at the center of it all, the catalyst for change that would reshape Alar-Earth relations for generations. When the holographic connection finally closed, she stood in Garrett's office, looking exhausted and triumphant in equal measure. Well, Garrett said, that was something. That was necessary. She touched her side again, that unconscious gesture. But it's done. What happens now? Now I go back, help implement reforms, testify at trials, rebuild what they tried to destroy. She looked at him. Now I do my job, but as myself this time. Thane approached her, expression carrying a respect that went deeper than military courtesy. That was masterfully done, Commander, but she said, the assembly is voting on emergency reforms. Everything you called for is being implemented. Good, but it's going to be difficult. Months of testimony, political battles, resistance from those who profited from the old system. Thane paused. Are you ready for that? No, Celine said honestly, but I'm doing it anyway. That's leadership. That's just being too stubborn to quit. Thane smiled, the expression transforming her serious features into something warmer. The best leaders usually are. She gestured to the waiting dropship. We should move. The charges are filed, but the situation is volatile. I'd prefer you in coalition protection as quickly as possible. I need a few minutes, Celine said. Thane looked between Celine and Garrett, reading the situation with the tactical assessment of someone who'd spent years understanding human dynamics. Of course, she said. I'll be with the ship when you're ready. She left them alone in the office. The silence that followed felt heavy, full of words neither of them quite knew how to say. So, Garrett said finally, you're leaving. Yes. Back to commanding fleets and reforming governments. Something like that. Sounds exhausting. It will be. Celine moved closer. Garrett, I want to ask you something. Ask. Come with me. The words landed like a physical impact. Garrett stared at her, certain he'd misheard. What? Come with me. To coalition space. We need medical reform. We need someone who understands that patients are people, not assets. Someone who can teach coalition medical staff what you taught me. She was serious. Absolutely serious. Celine, you could consult, advisory position. A few months a year, keep your clinic here, but help us build something better there. Her words came faster, more urgent. You have wisdom we need, understanding of what medicine should be. I want the coalition needs. No. The words stopped her. No. That's your world, Celine. Garrett gestured at the clinic around them. Mine is here. These patients, this work, this quiet place where I can fix people without politics or power struggles. But listen to me. He took her hands, made her look at him. What you're doing is important, necessary. You're going to change things, make them better. But that's your fight, your purpose. He squeezed her hands gently. Mine is different. Mine is making sure that when someone bleeds on my doorstep at midnight, they get treated like they matter. Whether they're commanders or spacers or lost tourists, that's what I do. That's who I am. Understanding crossed her features, acceptance mixed with disappointment. You need your sanctuary too, she said quietly. I need my sanctuary too. He smiled. But Celine, you're welcome back, anytime. For medical treatment or terrible coffee, or just to remember what it's like to be ordinary for a few days. You mean that? I mean that. She pulled him into an embrace, sudden and fierce and completely uncommander-like. Garrett held her, feeling the tremor in her shoulders that suggested this goodbye cost more than she wanted to admit. Thank you, she whispered against his shoulder, for everything, for seeing me, for treating me like I was just another stubborn patient, for giving me back myself. You always had yourself, Garrett said. You just forgot for a while. They stood like that for a long moment. Two people who had found unexpected connection in the middle of chaos, who'd learned that sometimes the most important healing had nothing to do with wounds. Finally, Celine pulled back. I should go, she said. You should. Garrett, yes. Will you remember me? He smiled. How could I forget? You're the worst patient I ever had. She laughed through tears. And you're the worst cook I ever met. Fair assessment. They walked to the clinic entrance together. The coalition dropship waited Thane standing at the base of the ramp, giving them space but clearly ready to depart. At the doorway, Celine paused, looked back at the clinic that had been her sanctuary for 7 days, at the examination table where she'd been sutured, at the supply closet she'd organized, at the kitchen where she'd made terrible coffee, at all the ordinary moments that had saved her. Thank you, she said again. You're welcome. Now go reform your government. Try not to start any wars while doing it. No promises. She walked toward the dropship, her bearing straight and military. Commander Celine returning to duty, but halfway there she stopped, turned back, touched the bandages on her side one last time. Garrett stood in the clinic doorway and raised his coffee cup in salute. The gesture ridiculous and perfect, and exactly what the moment needed. Celine smiled, genuinely smiled. Then she saluted military precision and waved. Just a simple wave, person to person. The dropship ramp closed behind her. The engines powered up with the distinctive hum of Aylar technology. And then she was gone. Garrett stood in the doorway long after the ship disappeared into the Nevada sky. Stood there holding his coffee cup and feeling the absence of someone who'd only been in his life for 7 days, but had somehow become important in ways he hadn't expected. Finally, he turned back into the clinic. There was work to do, damage to repair from the Corvath assault, patients who would come needing treatment, supplies to reorder, the ordinary business of being a frontier medic. He found a piece of paper on his desk, Celine's handwriting, clean and precise. Thank you for seeing me. As Garrett folded the note carefully, put it in his desk drawer, where he'd find it on the days when the work felt meaningless and the isolation felt heavy, and the question of whether any of this mattered became too loud to ignore. Then he went to clean the blood from his floor. Again. 6 months passed the way time always did in the desert, slowly, inexorably, with the kind of patience that came from existing in a place where seasons barely changed and days blurred into one continuous present. Garrett treated patients, fixed broken bones and infected wounds and all the small catastrophes that happened when humans insisted on living in places that didn't want them. He rebuilt the damage from the core of the soul. He made terrible coffee. He did not forget. The annual Veterans Memorial Service was held in the Outpost Community Center. Small affair, maybe 80 people, former soldiers mostly, the kind who'd served and left and tried to build new lives in quiet places. Garrett went because he always went, because remembering mattered even when, especially when the memories hurt. He was standing near the back, coffee in hand. Someone else had made it, thank God, when the keynote speaker was announced. We're honored to have with us today Commander Celine of the ALER Coalition Defense Forces. She'll be speaking about humanity and service and the importance of seeing soldiers as people first. Garrett's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. Celine walked onto the small stage and the room went silent. She looked different, stronger somehow. Her uniform carried new insignia that Garrett's limited knowledge of coalition rank couldn't quite parse. But her bearing was the same blend of commander and person he'd watched her reclaim in his clinic. She spoke about Kai's gate, about the 300 soldiers she'd lost, about learning that grief and duty could coexist, that being human or ALER mattered more than being legendary, about how a stubborn medic in a frontier clinic had taught her that being seen as ordinary was the highest form of respect. She didn't name him, but her eyes found his in the crowd and her smile said everything that needed saying. After the speech, after the polite applause and the formal thank yous, she found him. Surprised, she said, "You came to Nevada for a memorial service." "I came for this memorial service and for terrible coffee." She gestured at his cup. "Although someone else made that batch, I can tell by the fact that it's drinkable." "My coffee isn't that bad." "Your coffee violates several health codes. We discussed this." They stood there grinning at each other like idiots, while around them the memorial reception continued. "Walk with me," Celine asked. They went outside into the desert evening. The sun was setting, painting the sky in colors that reminded Garrett of her eyes. "So," he said, "Commander of Coalition Defense Forces. That's new. Interim position, until reforms are complete and we can hold proper elections." She smiled. "Turns out testifying against corrupt government and reforming military structure gets you promoted whether you want it or not." "How's it going?" "Exhausting, fulfilling, terrible, and wonderful in equal measure." She looked at him. "I'm implementing changes, medical reforms, training programs that teach staff to see patients as people, ethics oversight, all the things that should have existed already." "Sounds like you're busy." "I am," she paused, "but I made time for this because I wanted to see you, to say thank you again." "You already thanked me." "Then I'm thanking you twice. Deal with it." Garrett laughed, still as stubborn as ever. "Some things don't change." She pulled out a data chip. "Although some things do. This is an offer, consulting position with Coalition Medical Division. A few weeks per year. Help us train staff, review protocols, teach people what you taught me." "Celine, before you say no, listen. You keep your clinic. You keep your life here. This is just sharing your wisdom sometimes, when you can, if you want." She met his eyes. "The coalition needs people who understand that everyone bleeds the same, who know that medicine is about seeing the person, not the rank. We need you, Garrett. I need you." He took the data chip, turned it over in his hands. "Would I have to drink better coffee?" "Significantly better coffee. It's mandatory." "That's asking a lot." "I know." Garrett looked at her. This woman who'd stumbled into his clinic, bleeding and stubborn and running from everything, who'd learned to be herself again in the space of 7 days, who'd gone back and changed an entire government because she remembered that people mattered more than power. "I'll think about it," he said. "Really, really. Can't promise anything, but I'll consider it." Celine's smile was brilliant. "That's all I ask." They walked further into the desert, two people who'd found unexpected connection and somehow managed to keep it despite distance and duty and all the things that should have made it impossible. "How long are you staying?" Garrett asked. 3 days. I have meetings in New Geneva after that, but I have 3 days for memorial events and terrible coffee and maybe organizing your supply closet again because I guarantee it's a disaster." It's organized perfectly. It's organized chaotically. There's a difference. That sounds like criticism. That sounds like someone who's going to fix your organization system whether you like it or not. Garrett laughed, actually laughed, the sound carrying across the desert evening. 3 days, he said. We can work with 3 days. Yes, Celine said. We can. They walked back toward the outpost as the desert sky darkened and stars began appearing overhead. The same stars that hung over Coalition space and Earth and all the places where people lived and fought and tried to make meaning from chaos. But here in this small corner of Nevada, two people walked together and talked about supply closets and coffee and all the ordinary things that made life worth living. Because sometimes the most extraordinary thing was being seen. And sometimes being ordinary was exactly enough. Garrett made coffee the next morning. Terrible coffee. Aggressively terrible coffee. Celine drank it anyway, complaining the entire time, and somehow that made it perfect. Outside, the desert sun rose on another day at the edge of everywhere. Inside, two people who'd learned that wisdom came in unexpected packages, prepared to spend 3 days being ordinary together. It was Garrett thought exactly what they both needed. And watching Celine reorganize his supply closet while arguing about proper inventory systems, he smiled. Some things he'd learned were better discovered as they happened. Some people were worth finding even when you weren't looking. And some connections, no matter how unlikely, were meant to last. 3 days passed the way good things always did, too quickly. On the third evening, they stood in the clinic doorway watching the Coalition transport descend once more. This time, the goodbye felt different. Not an ending, a pause. Same time next year, Celine asked, or whenever you need terrible coffee and arguments about medical protocols. That's a standing offer. That's a standing offer. She touched her side one final time. The wounds fully healed now, no scars visible on Aylar's skin, but the memory remained. Of being seen, of being ordinary, of finding peace in a place she'd stumbled into while running for her life. Thank you, Garrett Hollis, for everything. Thank you, Celine, for reminding me why the work matters. The transport waited, duty called. But this time she went willingly, eagerly even, because now she knew she could always come back, and in the quiet clinic at the edge of everywhere, Garrett watched her leave and smiled. Some connections he'd learned didn't need proximity to remain strong. Some people stayed with you even when they left. He went inside to make terrible coffee. Alone but not lonely, connected even in solitude. The rain still fell sometimes on Outpost 47, still recycled, still not quite real. But what they'd found together was real. And that, Garrett thought, as he poured his coffee and settled in for another evening of frontier medicine, was all that mattered. The shelter had been real. The care had been real. The seeing and being seen had been real. Everything else was just noise. And in the quiet spaces between the noise, two people had found exactly what they'd been missing: each other.